Professor Peter Rowe obtained his secondary education at England and post-secondary education at Toronto and University of Waterloo in Canada. He joined the University of Waterloo in 1959 at the Department of Mathematics and moved to the Department of Electrical Engineering in 1960, which he has served for nearly 5 decades in various capacities. He has served several terms as chair of the Department of Systems Design Engineering and is presently the Director of International Exchange Programs at the University of Waterloo. Over a career spanning 5 decades, he has taught a wide variety of subjects both at the University of Waterloo and abroad, at levels from adult education to advanced postgraduate study. He was a member of the team that designed and taught the first undergraduate engineering design course ever offered in the United States in 1963. He has published over 150 technical refereed journal and conference papers, authored 4 books, and several articles of general interest for the public press. He initiated the concept of student computing in engineering using the local area network, which established the design parameters for the Watchstar system, later on evolved into the campus-wide Nexus system at the University of Waterloo. DEI was honored to host Professor Rowe at the International Seminar on Spiritual Awakenings Courses in January 2008. He was the chief architect for the MOU, which was signed between DEI and the University of Waterloo in July 2008. And he has been honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Albag Educational Institute for his lifelong contributions to the systems movement. I have great pleasure in inviting Professor Rowe to deliver his plenary talk.
Thank you very much, Satish, for that pleasant introduction. And revered Dr. Satsangi, it's a great pleasure to see you here taking in these presentations, especially the ones that had you and your relations on. And also to all the delegates and invited guests, thank you very much for being here. And my talk is historical. So it's not like Mukti's presentation where everybody joined in, and it's not like the previous ones which are talking about really future applications of system theory. I'm talking about old ones. So it will be old ones, and although the preceding volume that all delegates have received have got my paper, I will try to follow it a bit, but it's not necessary that I will stay with it, because I have things to say about various people, some of whom are actually in this room, that you may not have heard before. Now, the outline of the presentation. First, I'll talk about graph theory and how it began, and then about Gustav Kirchhoff and his laws. Then I'll jump forward and we'll talk about what was going on after the Second World War and in the 1950s. And then I'll do a little digression and talk about alternative ways of looking at system analysis, some of them, mostly flow graphs and bond graphs. And then I will talk about what I know, because all the rest is what I've heard, which is what went on in the last 4 decades of the 20th century at the University of Waterloo, because I was there all the way through those 4 decades. And then I will try and come to an end. If I fail to come to an end at that time, you can, Satish, yes, you're the session chairman, you can get a hook and pull me off the stage. So, let us begin. First of all, graph theory. Now, it is common knowledge that graph theory was started by Euler in the 18th century, and it started with the burghers and bridges of Königsberg. And the nice thing about Königsberg is it's kind of like Madras. It's not called Madras anymore, it's called Chennai. Königsberg is not called Königsberg anymore, it's called Kaliningrad, because the Russians changed its name. But it sort of brings a sort of connection with what goes on in this country. By the way, if you Google Königsberg, you will come up with this map that's here, and it has the famous bridges, completely outlined. There are more bridges, by the way, over the river, and nowadays not all those bridges are still there, but that's a different matter. If you, and here's the next slide has a sort of generalized view of the whole thing, and what you have to note is that if you want to walk like the burghers of Königsberg did, from one landmass to another on a Sunday morning, and start on any one of them and end up where you began, you would have to have always an even number of bridges connecting each of the particular landmasses. That's what Euler discovered, and therefore you get the idea of an Eulerian graph. Let's go to the next slide. The next, which is a graph which is in fact a union of edge disjoint circuits. Now there's a picture of Euler. I put on the slide his famous identity, that's the e to the I pi plus 1 is equal to 0, because that's what he's, I think, most famous for. He did solve the Königsberg bridge problem, and he did start graph theory, but he didn't even think in terms of graphs. He thought in terms of paths. And nobody thought about graphs in the 18th century. It took them at least a century to start thinking about linear graphs, but still, they all began, I think, with Leonhard Euler. Let's go to the next slide. I might actually, if I go on at this rate, I've only got 19 slides. If I go on at this rate, I'm actually going to finish before 150 minutes are over. Here's the, here is the stylized version of the same bridges, and there's the graph, and you can see that it doesn't have an even number of, the degree of each vertex is not even, and so therefore it's not an Eulerian graph, and so therefore it's quick. You can't start anywhere and end anywhere at the same place, going over every bridge on a Sunday morning stroll. You know, that's the way it is. Going over every bridge once. But, by the way, if you took away one of the bridges, for instance, the one between, these ones are numbered rather than lettered, the one between vertices, say, 1 and 4, you could start at 2 and end at 3 by an Eulerian path, because that would make the appropriate number of even degree vertices. Now, let's move on. One whole century, or roughly one whole century, and here you have a postage stamp from the DDR, that's the former communist portion, East Germany, and it's a postage stamp of Gustav Kirchhoff. And the one major connection between him and Euler is that he has a connection also with Königsberg. He was born there. I didn't know that, actually, but there he is. He's not a baby in that picture. He's an older gentleman. He, of course, brought us the famous laws, Kirchhoff's, or Kirchhoff, depending on how you care to pronounce him, voltage and current laws. And those are the laws that led to the whole body of topological network analysis. But nobody thought about that in a particular way. He was only talking about resistive networks. In fact, what he was interested in, things like Wheatstone bridges. And what did you do? The graph, or the network, was just the whole thing with the resistances taken out, and you had lines instead. And it took quite a little while, a very long while, before that was generalized. And that generalization took place much later. But in the meantime, we get to topology. Yes. In the meantime, that's to say in the ensuing century, I want to get on to the modern bit. I'm just going over this history quickly. In the meantime, we had the topological network analysis. And people started to realize that you could find ratios of tree admittance products and two-tree admittance products, and those things would give you, what would you give you? They would give you solution of linear systems. They'd give you solution of networks because you had the ratio of the two, and that would give you a transfer function between one place and another. And that worked. So that was the determinant, you observe that the determinant of A transpose, which A is the incidence matrix, is equal to the number of trees, and the determinant of A transpose is equal to the sum of tree admittance products. And if you do it with two trees, whoops. So all of those things lead to, you know, by inspection, if you can enumerate the number of trees in the graph, you can find the determinant of the transfer admittance products and so forth, just by looking at the graph. That was the whole idea, and that's the way it went. I read some papers that were presented, for instance, in China by a fellow by the name of Wang, the Wang algebra of networks, in the 1930s. So this was culminated, you'd have to say, in a series of papers in a variety of places. The famous names involved in the 50s would be Talbot in England and Percival in England, and Sundaram Seshu. I don't know anyone here who ever, does anyone? So now we move on. We've dealt with all of those things, and what happened? We've got the situation where we've got past World War II, and what happened then? Well, in World War II, and in the years just immediately preceding it, there was a major increase in scientific knowledge. There was a major increase in engineering works. You know, we had the invention of, well, rocketry. We had the invention of the cathode ray tube. We had the invention of radar. We had the invention of jet engines and television. And all of those things happened. And it took some time before engineering education caught up. Prior to the war, Second World War, engineering education seemed to be sort of handbook stuff. You did it by experience, you didn't do it by science. And what spearheaded the change was really all of these inventions associated with, well, what was then called modern technology. It's now kind of old. And it would seem, to my mind, that one needed to search for complete methods for linear system analysis because they became more complicated. One needed to deal first with electrical circuits because they were more complicated. One needed to look at more scientific and mathematical ways of teaching engineers. And this was spearheaded at MIT in the United States and at Imperial College also in the United Kingdom. So they all happened very quickly. In fact, when I was a student at the University of Toronto this is in the 50s, in 1957, I was being taught a course on what was called advanced mechanics. And the Sputnik went up. And my professor, who was a rather dull and dry old guy, was teaching from notes that he had written prior to World War II. And he would turn over the page and say, take this down. And that's how you sort of got the stuff. Suddenly he changed. He said, I'm going to change my whole course. I'm going to teach you orbital mechanics. And he brought out his real knowledge, which was kind of nice. And we learned about why you had to deal with heating when you're returning into the atmosphere, and what was known as escape velocity. We didn't know anything about this. Nobody did, right? But Sputnik was up there beeping away, and it changed. That changed the way, actually, the University of Toronto, which was an exceptionally backward place in those days as far as I was concerned. I was a student there, so I can say it. So there was a huge increase in research activity in North America and in Europe, and we're talking 1950s. All of a sudden, the Republic of India decided to do something about higher education in engineering, and the IITs were formed. And the University of Waterloo took its first students in 1957. I joined it in 1959, and I can tell you that first decade after the war was when things were really accelerating in engineering education, and I was very happy to be in a brand new institution and find out what was going on. So now let's just quickly look what was going on in the 50s in the States, and because this is where graph theoretic system modeling came from. And you look at the late 1950s, and I got a picture of Ernst Gillam in there. That was taken actually before the war. There he is teaching circuit theory in MIT. And he wrote a number of books. He was the PhD supervisor of a number of people from whom are academically descended, people like Hermann Koenig, Max van Valkenburg, and so forth. And and by the way, Seshu, the Seshu I've just, you people don't know Sundaram Seshu. He taught me, he was a student of Van Valkenburg at Illinois, and he proceeded, and he was an associate with M.B. Reid, who later moved to Michigan State. So that's, and then you see Horace Trent. Horace Trent was the person who published a milestone paper in the Journal of Acoustical, I've forgotten the name of the journal, but it's in my talk, and he was in my paper, and he was the person who put into the minds of people how to deal with linear systems, at least the idea of dealing with linear systems, not just as analogies with electrical networks. So there were mechanical engineers who would deal with vibrating systems, and the way they would do it was they would draw the analogy with an electrical network, because dampers can be related to resistances and so forth. And then they would draw the electrical network, and then they would use the topological formulas which Seshu and Maeda had done a lot of work on, and then they would go back to the original system. And that's a rather stupid way, not stupid, it's a rather unfortunate way of doing things, because you don't need to refer to analogies. And indeed, it was Hermann Koenig, by the way, Peter Bryant, I should just mention him. Peter wrote some papers on, one of them was called the A matrix of electrical networks. It was a fairly famous paper, probably in the IEEE. And he also came to the University of Waterloo and was there along with a number of other people during that rather expansive period of time. And he was kind of a nice fellow. I liked Peter a lot. But it was Hermann who really cottoned on to the very simple idea that Seshu and Maeda formalized the topological formulas. Trent broadened thinking about analogies, and Koenig established, this is it, he established the idea of a system graph as more than the geometry of a network. It was he who produced a simple idea. It's a simple and elegant idea that a terminal graph could represent the pairs of measurements of complementary through and across variables at the terminals of components, and the corresponding sets of equations among those variables that could, at least in principle, the variables could at least be deduced from direct measurements in a laboratory, would create a complete external model of a device, and that remains fundamental to the whole structure of graph theoretical system analysis. Without it, you don't have the system. With it, you do. And because you can interconnect components at their terminals, you interconnect their terminal graphs, and boom, you've got a system graph. And everybody who's been at DEI clearly knows this, because that's something which has been developed here in a big way. And I am truly enheartened about systems theory when I see people doing things in areas that I had never thought one might apply it, such as quantum computing. Now, I will get on to, I'll just do a little bit of a diversion to flow graphs and bond graphs. And it's funny, when I wrote this paper, I left out system dynamics, but that was equally developed by people like Forrester and Meadows. So there were, coming out of MIT, where Gilliman was, there were people thinking about how to model systems, and the models that were different from the linear graph models essentially are the block diagram models, which are still to this day used in the analysis of simple control systems. The flow graph models of Mason and his colleague Coates, they're slightly different, and the bond graph models, which were invented at MIT by Harold Painter. And it's important that one should know that these things were developed at a very similar time, in fact the same time, as the graph theoretic models. And of course there are relations among them, because if you're going to analyze a particular system, you'd better come to the same results whichever type of modeling technique you use. So therefore one knows a priori that they are absolutely equivalent. You can start with the one and get to the other. But the matter is that if you're interested in knowing the interaction of components, then you should go to the graph-theoretic model. If you're only interested in transfer functions, which gets you limited to linear systems, then you can consider yourself going to the flow graph models. And there are formulas and there are ways of reducing these things, and they're quite easy to learn. I learned them a long time ago, and I've forgotten them since. But how to do flow graph models of a linear graph system, I put that in my PhD thesis. That's a fair distance of time ago. And then there are the bond graphs, which describe energy flow. If you're interested purely in energy flow through a system, and you don't care about the relationships of components, you'll go to bond graph models. And if you want to learn about bond graph models, I invite you to go to where? To Lille, École Centrale de Lille in France, or to the university called Twente, in the Netherlands. And there you find great hives of bond graphers. And there are one or two of them all over the world, including some of my students. So if you don't know about them, they're interesting because they're graph-like, and they're linear graph-like. And you can, of course, derive the one. You can, of course, derive the bond graphs of a system from the linear graphs of a system, and you can do the reverse. One of my later PhD students actually worked out the complete equivalence between the two, and they're not all that easy, because for a bond graph there is always a dual, and for a graph there is not always a dual. And so when you want to look at how you deal with those things at the equivalence one way or another, you have to look at the underlying circuit and co-circuit matroids of the graph, which is associated with the graph, which is getting a little deeper. So let's move on to what happened with Hermann, because something did, right? He went to Flint, Michigan from Illinois in about 1956, is that correct? I don't know the date precisely. Others who were there include, of course, M.B. Reed, and then there was Tokad, and D.P. Brown, who was there. I think D.P. Brown was still there, Jack, when you were there? Yeah, D.P. Brown. And of course there was H.K. Keshavan, who had completed his master's degree at Illinois and became one of Koenig's, I think, Koenig's first PhD student, I'm not sure. So first, system theory can generalize circuit theory to include rotating machinery. And then we could perhaps go to other things like transistors and tube. I don't know whether you call them tubes or valves in this country. When I grew up as a teenager, they were called radio valves. And when I went to the United States, they were called electron tubes. Nobody calls them anything nowadays because they've been superseded by solid-state devices. But anyway, so what did we do at the University of Waterloo? Well, the first thing was Keshavan wanted to generalize system theory. And when he came to our new department when did he come to our new department? It was 1968. He came back from Kanpur. Keshavan had been the head of electrical engineering for a short time at the University of Waterloo. Then he came back here to Kanpur, where he was Dean of Graduate Studies, started the Computer Center, and I think he was Chair of Electrical Engineering, I'm not sure. And then we sent one of our colleagues, a great friend of mine by the name of George Soulis, back to this country to re-recruit Keshavan, and by golly, he succeeded. Where my student V.K. Atri was, as well as a postdoctoral fellow at the time. Keshavan called me and he said, we have to have a new curriculum for our systems design program. And I said, oh, that's fine. I designed the electrical engineering curriculum in a weekend. We should be able to do it pretty quickly. So So he called me back, and we set up the new undergraduate program, and we had the Department of Design, and then we decided to set up the new curriculum which involved a great deal of system theory. And since we were doing both design and systems, we called it Systems Design Engineering, and it has been that way ever since. And the curriculum that Cash and I designed over 2 or 3 meetings in the fall of '68 lasted and has lasted a very long time. So it was dynamic. What I'm trying to say, it was a dynamic experience. We didn't have the sort of problem of an academic structure which held you back so that you couldn't change the curriculum. Again, Prem Kara talked about some of the IITs being rather slow at changing their curriculum, and I know that the University of Toronto, where I was exceedingly slow at doing it, and yet it was known at that time as the best place in Canada. They've reformed themselves since then. So it's possible to set up new things and to do it, and we set it up so that we could generalize. Our new curriculum was going to be, that one's live, maybe I should be talking into it. He wanted to have a program that would deal with system analysis and design, and let's say physical systems, and then with socioeconomic systems, and with human systems. We did what was known as human systems design. That's ergonomics and various things like that. Those were the three prongs of the department. Well, and he said, well, in the physical systems, we're going to have to do things like generalizing what we're doing in physical systems. And we're going to bring in socioeconomic systems, and we're going to bring in human systems. So there were all sorts of people there. It was really quite auspicious to be there. Let me tell you about a few of the people from this subcontinent who were there. There was Vidyasagar. I'm sure people know Vidyasagar, who's just recently retired from TCS. There was Mahabala and Vishwanathan, both of them IIT Kanpur people. There was Kishore Singhal. There was K.D. Srivastava, a high voltage man. These are all people at the University of Waterloo. And there was S.T. Aryaratnam. Now, Aryaratnam came from what was then called Ceylon. His father was a prison manager. When he went on sabbatical leave to Ceylon, you would address a letter to it was still a monarchy, Ceylon at that time. You would address a letter to Aryaratnam, and it would be S.T. Aryaratnam, care of Her Majesty's prison, because that's where they lived. Which I always thought was kind of funny. You would think he was a prisoner. He was actually a rather erudite young man. He's not young anymore, but he's still erudite. The place was full of what I'll have to call bright, upperly mobile academics, and there were quite a lot of results. Talking about where the results were coming, well, we had Prem Satsanghi, who was interested in socioeconomic systems. We had Muthu Chandrasekhar. M. Chandrasekhar, I don't know anyone, if people know Chandrasekhar, he was an IITK person. His thesis was on pipe networks. And if you have a civil engineering background, it really, using Chandrasekhar's results, you could design water supply for new developments in a way that was deterministic, which was kind of nice. And then there was M.V. Bhatt. I think he was also from one of the IITs. And we had a person, my student, whose name was Devasagayam Pillai. I think his first name was Sitharaman. Sitharaman Devasagayam Pillai. Now the problem with him was that he had a very long name, and when he went to use his name, he would use fragments of it. And it depended on which fragment he was actually going to use. So he was a Sri Lankan, and he went to the University of Calgary, I think. Maybe it was the University of Alberta, but I can't remember which one, to do a master's degree. And he used one name. And it wasn't the same name as he used when he was at his university in Sri Lanka. And then he came to the University of Waterloo and he had different letters which had different names, and at one point the graduate office had 2 complete files on this applicant, one under one name and one under another. But they were reconciled, and he came to me and became my student in power system planning. And then he got the PhD. Later on, he went to the University of Toronto, where he continued his practice of using different names, different partial names, and he also worked for the World Bank using similar strategies. And finally, when the U of T caught up with him, he was enrolled in two different undergraduate programs under 2 different names. And so they came back to the University of Waterloo and they said, did he actually get his PhD? And the answer was he did. Because they also went to the University of Alberta and said, did he get his master's degree? And the answer was no, he didn't. And then they went back to Sri Lanka and said, did he ever get his bachelor's degree? And the answer was no, he didn't. So his first earned degree was his doctorate, which was kind of clever. He later got from our management department a master's degree, and somewhere in the Toronto he got a bachelor's degree. He did his degrees in absolutely the wrong order, backwards. But he was also nearly put into jail because of what he was doing with his names. That's my friend Davis Agayam Pillai. Chandrasekhar, I mentioned, he worked on simulation programs. He wrote a set of software called ProSim for doing graph theoretic analysis just before his death. And followed up after him was Chad Schmidtke. Schmidtke wrote the software that is used for training Canadian astronauts to run the robot arms on the satellites and things, which is kind of fun. Then we had Gordon Andrews, who was a Canadian. His work was on, what was it on? 3-dimensional mechanics. He wrote a lot of stuff on that, and his student John McPhee, who's still there. You're ringing the bell, it's too soon. I haven't got there yet. I've got 4 more slides to go, and I've still got another 100 minutes. Okay, and so there was John McPhee, whose work is on design of automotive stuff using graph theoretic methods. And then we had F.C. Wong. Wong was a student of Shaker, and his work was on thermodynamic systems. So there was a fair number of bits going on. Let's get some more of this stuff, because I'm told to hurry up. But also I'll hurry. So what are the things we did? We did sensitivity analysis. My student, who is here in Delhi at the moment, Ashok Seth, his thesis was on sensitivity analysis, and he went on to a very distinguished career, as you all probably know. He did distributed systems, so that is to say systems whose components are characterized by partial differential equations. So we did everything that would be rather equivalent to finite element method. We did probabilistic systems. Some of my students, and I'm trying to think who or which, did work on systems whose parameters are drawn from probability distributions, equivalents of the graph theoretic method to bond graphs and flow graph methods, and established the rigorous mathematical connections rather than it just seems to work. I'll tell you a little bit about A.K. Seth, because Ashok was a very brilliant man, but he was in a car accident. And the car he was in was driven by another Indian student. You should never let Indian students drive cars in Canada because they go too fast. And he had only got his driver's license. He went down the highway 401 and turned the car end over end, spewing out his passengers out of the car as he went. And one of them was Ashok Seth, and another one was D.P.S. Seth. I don't know where he is, but I know he's in this country somewhere. And Ashok fell out of the car, and of course he was badly injured. And I visited him in hospital, and he, at that point, couldn't remember the name of his sister, who was living in Montreal. So anyway, he recovered, and he came back to finish his thesis. But the only thing was that he had notes, and he had brought stuff to me, and he would come to me afterwards, and he'd say, Peter, because he called me, we are a little informal, or sometimes he'd say, Dr. Rowe, I have discovered this, that, and the other thing. Here's some new results. And I would say, Ashok, you've done that before. Go back and read your own notes. He discovered most of his main results twice, which is really kind of interesting. And one of my students, we did quite a lot of things. Well, there was agricultural... I must tell you about K.R. Vasudev. K.R. Vasudev, whose name is now V.K. Atri, I always called him K.R., and after a while, after he graduated, nobody else called him K.R. because they all called him Vasu. He came to the University of Waterloo. He was my first PhD student, and he arrived in Canada and saw the newspaper, which had a big headline which said, "Hotel Fire in Lucknow." Now, Lucknow is a well-known city here, but it's not a well-known city in Canada. In fact, there's a small village called Lucknow, and the hotel caught on fire. But how was Vasu to know that, right? So he came to the electrical engineering department, and he said, "May I please speak to Professor Rowe? I've come to be his student." And it happened that at that moment, I was in Tokyo, in Japan, giving a paper in a conference. And the department secretary said, "Well, I'm sorry, but Dr. Rowe's in Tokyo." So Vasu says, "Well, I'll just sit down and wait," because he had learned that Lucknow was a nearby place. And of course, from Waterloo, you can quickly drive to London, to Paris, to Brussels, to Lisbon. They're all within an hour's drive, and Dublin is closer. And and also we have a little spot which is known in Canada as Delhi, because they don't pronounce Delhi. We have Delhi, and that's also rather close. And we also, and Kitchener-Waterloo used to be called Berlin. So there are funny stories about these people. And my one last student who did the bond graph analysis, he also applied, spent some time applying graph theory to various other things like musical instruments and to livestock. I saw a linear graph model of a pig produced by Stephen Burkett. So it's really quite interesting that you can think of almost anything. Burkett was a musician, and his research now is mostly with a contract with the makers of grand pianos by the name of Steinway. Almost all of the early contributors are retired. One of Keshavan's students who did the field theory models is still active in the department. John McPhee, whom I mentioned earlier, his work is with the automotive industry, has big contracts with Toyota. By the way, Canada exports more Japanese cars than it imports. Then there's a lot of work with MapleSoft. MapleSoft is a competitor with MATLAB. And all of its simulation programs are based on work done by one Chad Schmidtke, who was a all of their simulation programs are based on graph theoretic modeling. So you should give up MATLAB and take up MapleSoft. And I just mentioned my former student works on bond graph model, the GTM, and he does his work. Well, now we can get to the last slide. He does his work with Steinways. I am still at the University of Waterloo, although retired since '59. That's more than, actually it's now 50 years and 2 months. And it was, I think, a roller coaster ride of development. It is always great, and that's why I keep looking at Prem over there, Prem Kalra. It's always great to be in a new place where you can apply new ideas in new ways, and we had an awful luck to be exactly the right age to do it. If anyone has any questions, thank you very much for listening to me.